Hi everyone. In this episode, I want to talk about the friendship between Joey Snake and Wheels. This is, of course, one of the major storylines of Degrassi in its totality, but it's also one that hasn't really been adequately analyzed, in my opinion. It's a storyline that, of course, spans from, let's say, Season 1, Episode 10 of Degrassi Junior High, and goes all the way through Season 4 of The Next Generation when we see the final appearance of Wheels. Where do they begin? Well, as I said, Season 1, Episode 10, they're a band, and prior to that, there's a lot of retcons that happen in Season 1 of Junior High, aren't there? And this is one of the retcons. At first, Joey is a little bit different. He has a sidekick called Hank. Snake is very different. But at some point, again, Season 1, Episode 10, they're suddenly in a band called the Zit Remedy. They're going to perform at the talent show for Parents' Night. And we don't really get much of a origin story beyond that. So we can't really say too much about the origins, unfortunately, of these people as friends. But there is enough in the show that we can make a pretty strong analysis of them as a group and as individuals with their own particular characteristics and personalities. And we can look at the dynamics of that group, which is what I'm probably primarily interested in with this video. I'll summarize a few points quickly. Joey Jeremiah is the smallest in stature, but he's the biggest, loudest personality with his very garish dress sense consisting of Hawaiian shirts and vests and hats. He's introduced to us as a sort of Canadian Bart Simpson, we could say. He's loud, he's brash, he's extroverted, he's always doing some kind of shtick. He's the frontman of the band, and it's his dreams of rock and roll stardom that keeps the band going. Well, it's also his tastes for mischief that gets the group into a lot of trouble over the seasons. He's often eager to break the rules. We see that he's very vain, but he really doesn't have much reason to be vain because so often his pursuits end up totally fruitless. But for all of his faults, we also see Joey Jeremiah is kind, he's caring, he's compassionate, and he's loyal, except when he isn't. Archibald Snake Simpson is in some ways the opposite of Joey. Well, he's very tall. He's a complete pushover. He's far less adventurous, probably, but Joey never has too much trouble convincing Snake to go along with his mischief. And, well, Snake has young ladies lining up to date him. He's apparently a very attractive character in the show. Snake really lacks the confidence to succeed romantically. If Joey is vain without reason, you can flip that for Snake. He has reason to be vain, but he's kind of just a dopey guy who doesn't believe in himself, and so he's he has a lot of problems there. Ultimately, the problem, I think, is that Snake never really feels himself to be adequate, and he's held back by his own insecurities. And this gives Snake a bit of a neurotic streak, which is what kind of comes to a peak in School's Out. Derek Wheeler is more introverted, and early in the series, he's actually presented as sort of the level-headed mediator between Joey and Snake. He's not very gifted academically, but he does seem to be willing to work hard, and he wants to succeed, even if success just means skating by with a 50 on his exams. But it's not long before Wheels' life starts to unravel. In fact, I would trace this back to the origins of the friendship, because in this episode, Parents' Night, we see the unannounced arrival of Mike Nelson, his birth father, which I think instills in Wheels a crisis of self that ultimately haunts him throughout the remainder of the series and becomes much, much worse after his adoptive parents are killed in an automobile accident, as you're all aware, I'm sure. Prior to that, the kind of conflicts we would see in the group would be things like Wheels can't practice with the band because he needs tutoring to get his marks up, or Snake is taking classical guitar lessons and that's somehow a problem for him, so whatever it is. But once John and Helen Wheeler are killed, the problems become much more complicated. Now here's something to think about. What would Wheels and Snake be without Joey? I kind of want to do a Bechdel test when I think about them. Do we ever see Snake and Wheels alone together talking about anything besides Joey? And they do pass this test. Primarily, the closest they really come to kind of bonding together, I think, is when Heather likes Wheels and they make out on the couch on that porch. But apart from that, we don't really see too much of Snake and Wheels really bonding or talking about anything particularly interesting together, which is, I think, kind of unfortunate. I mean, again, we don't really know much about the origins of how or why they came together. I think most people would probably assume that it's part of like a package deal with Joey bringing the two of them together. And I can easily I can imagine two kind of introverted weirdos being friends as easily as not. They seem friendly enough to each other when they're together. But also, pretty early on in the aftermath of the death of the Wheelers, we do see the distance in their friendship come to the surface in a very dramatic and I'd say kind of a harsh way, when Snake finds himself unable to speak to or even really acknowledge poor grieving Wheels. We see both of them are upset by this. Wheels, he needs Snake to be there for him as a friend. That's kind of all that Wheels has at that point, because he's mad at Joey. He blames Joey in some ways for the death of his parents. Or at least he kind of says if Joey hadn't convinced him to lie to his parents and go sneak out and record their song together instead of going to the movies with them, that Wheels would have gone to the movie with him and he would have died too. And that's what he wanted at that point. And all of those kind of things that he's going through because of his grief. Despite this, Joey does everything he can to be there for Wheels and be supportive. He's trying his best, even as Wheels kind of hates him at that point and is rejecting him and wants nothing to do with him. Joey still sees that Wheels needs support, and he's trying, but not Snake. So why won't Snake talk to Wheels? It's never really explained, and it's never really resolved either. After Season's greetings, I think they're just kind of pals again, I guess. But they never dealt with anything, which I imagine really didn't help Wheels to cope with his trauma, with his grief, maybe his sense of being unwanted or displaced in the universe. That's kind of a thread that the show didn't explicitly articulate, but I really feel it in these characters in Wheels in particular, and I think you will probably agree with that, I hope. But Snake's issues probably have kind of deep and dark roots that, like many things of that nature, exist without his conscious awareness. What I think, I can only imagine, Snake is either so hypersensitive to emotions, or he's so emotionally alienated in life in general that he can't really deal with heavy emotions. And the two extremes can look pretty similar. And isn't Snake kind of traumatized a lot? In any event, at this point in Snake's life, maybe he just never been in a situation that required this kind of emotional difficulty to be faced, and probably had never been in such a situation where he would have to take on this kind of responsibility to be there for someone going through this kind of grief, who just needed him to be there as a friend. Why is Snake this way? There may be no precise cause. The show does give us some clues about Snake's home life and family life that might help us understand a little bit about his psyche. I think it might be safe to say, felt like he was sort of living in the shadow of his older brother Glenn, who was a basketball star, who was going to med school, and so on and so forth. But then we also see Glenn comes home to tell his family that he's gay and he's living with a partner, and Snake's parents disown Glenn. Snake learns by the end of that episode to accept Glenn, but I imagine even if he also realizes his parents are wrong for disowning their own son, Snake probably wants their approval. And maybe things like approval and affection, I don't know if I'm going out on a limb here, but maybe Snake's parents don't really express those kind of things. And maybe that's kind of part of the problem. Again, we don't know, but I think it's something that you can imagine, just thinking about the little bits of things we see about Snake's parents. That might be part of the issue. Whatever the case is, when Snake finds himself needing to be there for a friend, needing to comfort and console someone going through grief, he finds himself repulsed by the very prospect of doing that, and unable to explain or understand his repulsion, while at the same time, I think probably on some level recognizing that these are just basic human emotions that he's unable to process or express. Snake ends up feeling even more abject and further alienated, and more like he's just not fully human, maybe. And in this, I think we find the seeds of a kind of resentment planted in Snake. Snake, I think, started to harbor a deep and maybe kind of strange resentment. And I don't know if it necessarily had to be towards Wheels, or if Wheels was just kind of the easiest target. But whatever the case is, it ended up being that Snake resents Wheels simply because Wheels needed Snake to be there for him, and Snake, for whatever reason, couldn't be there for him, which is pretty heavy stuff. And maybe Snake, being someone who feels himself to be inadequate, who lacks confidence, all of this kind of stuff, maybe he's prone to blaming himself, and possibly his resentment was also a resentment of his own self on some level, because he knew, we know this from dialogue, he knew that he was wrong, that he should have been there for Wheels. But the whole problem with Snake's insecurity was that he just couldn't stand up for himself. So it's kind of an issue that he himself couldn't resolve, and probably would have benefited from like therapy or counseling or something of that nature, which is true of a lot of Degrassi characters, I suppose. But what he could do in lieu of dealing with his own issues was he could start to resent and hate Wheels, not only for needing him, but also because Wheels' need really showed Snake how weak he himself was. And maybe that was kind of hard for Snake to bear. And needless to say, Wheels himself becomes more and more prone to straining every relationship, to pushing away everyone who cares about him in ensuing seasons. But why was Wheels that way? I kind of wonder if Snake had just been there for Wheels when he needed him, maybe that would have kind of saved Wheels. Like maybe Wheels wouldn't have gone so far off the deep end and gotten so lost and acted the way that he did if Snake had just been there as a friend for him when he really needed him. Because I think Wheels just ended up feeling lost. Now, what of Joey? In his role as the sort of leader of the group, Joey was the one who instigated pretty much all of the trouble that the group got into with his ill-advised schemes. But we also find examples where Joey's own vanity and insecurity hurt the others. For instance, remember when Snake had his first date with Melanie, and Joey and Wheels show up at the theater just to ruin that date, basically. Whether or not Wheels and Snake would have been best friends without Joey, I really don't think Wheels would have been antagonistic in this way in particular towards Snake, but really in any way. But in particular, the fact that Snake had a young lady who was interested in him, Wheels would have thought that was cool, I think. But I think it's something that bothered Joey to see that Snake, this guy who has no confidence whatsoever, who Joey probably sees as kind of a big dope, that he has someone interested in him. Well, Joey kind of at that point doesn't really have anyone interested in him. For Joey and Wheels as a pair, I think there's some kind of polarity between them. Like in the whole MBTI thing, you sometimes hear about INFJs and ENFPs. There's polarity between them. I think that's a real thing, and I think between Joey and Wheels, they have a lot of polarity. And Joey's personality and his extroversion, it brings something out in Wheels and makes him feel more alive or something like that. And that's why Wheels is so eager to go along with Joey and his antics. The whole ordeal at the theater with Snake having his date with Melody and Joey and Wheels showing up to just cause trouble, I read that as very much motivated by Joey's jealousy, his incredulity, his insecurities, just his disbelief that Snake can get a date. Well, for all of Joey's bravado and his self-image as a real Casanova, it doesn't get Joey anything. Insecurity is something that really motivates a lot of behavior when we're at the age these characters were at in Degrassi. And these characters are insecure for different reasons and they have different ways of dealing with their insecurity. Joey, for instance, of course, overcompensates. Wheels becomes kind of self-destructive as he settles into his sense of fate, his sense that he's just somehow cosmically displaced and unwanted, and he kind of pursues that as a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. That's not the best way to cope, of course, but it is a way to cope. And I do think Wheels did eventually kind of, once he became old enough that he was going to be able to leave Toronto and go out west and start over again, I think Wheels could have ended up fairly well adjusted. And if it weren't for his carelessness and just a split second of what happened in Schools Out, I think Wheels could have been fine out in the west of Canada. Snake, on the other hand, I don't feel like Snake ever really truly coped with his own insecurity. And it plagued him even into Degrassi The Next Generation. Joey, especially when he was young in Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High, of course, he was very vain and he put a premium on vanity, and I think he kind of thought that's just how you should be. And he was cognizant of Snake's insecurity and he found it like funny on some level. Because, I mean, Joey's just good with people, right? He's extroverted. He's ultimately going to become a salesman. He can read people and understand people. Like Caitlin said at one point, Joey's smart with people, whatever. So Joey kind of finds it humorous to kind of deride Snake because Snake is insecure and he seems dopey and a goofball to Joey. And perhaps this, diminutive, tiny Joey likes to deride Snake as kind of a show of dominance within the hierarchy of the group, the friendship. So here, I want to bring in a bit of literary theory, for lack of a better word. In clowning, as a performance art and as a kind of subculture, I guess, there's a trope that we call the hierarchy of clowns. In the hierarchy of clowns, you have a few different types of clowns that are in a hierarchy. So you have the white clown, a type of clown that will have like white paint on their face and look in a particular way. You have the red clown, also called the Auguste, who has more red in their face and has more grotesque face makeup and tends to be the butt of the jokes. You have the character clown, who's often a hobo or a tramp, or could be any number of other characters or careers that a clown might play, like a baker or policeman or whatever the case may be. And then sometimes you also have something called the ringmaster. These are things you see at the circus if you've ever gone to the circus and see clowns perform. It's pretty basic to clowning, and it's pretty basic when you see someone who's become a clown. They tend to try to portray one of these types, but it's not limited to clowning. And if you start to think about movies or TV or cartoons or any other form of entertainment, I think you'll see that this is just a very common trope in Western entertainment in particular, and it's something that's just become kind of baked into our own like cultural sensibilities, and it's something that just kind of works. So if you think of Seinfeld follows this hierarchy. Jerry is the white clown, George is the Auguste, Kramer is the hobo, and Elaine is the ringmaster. If you understand how that dynamic works as a hierarchy, you understand the hierarchy of clowns. Or think of Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Goofy. Right? It's there too. Think of Groucho, Chico, and Harpo. It's just something that's become kind of a cultural shorthand, I think, that works in ensemble comedy. Now, as clowns, there's all kind of rules and standards in clowning organizations for these types, what they should look like, how they should act, how they should be defined. But in reality, this is a pretty old set of tropes, and it's transmitted through low culture. So there's not really that much use for theory when it comes to actual practice, how you perform as these clown types. And it's just a format that's pretty flexible. You can play the types however you want, but typically we do perceive of a hierarchy where the white clown is a type that's above the red clown or the Auguste. So you have basically a straight man character, I guess you could call the Auguste. That's where the idea of the straight man has maybe one of its purest forms of existence, is in the red clown getting the pie in his face, or his or her face, or whatever the case may be. I'm not sure the hobo or the tramp is necessarily above or below, all of that said. Usually they're considered to be below, but these are this is a format that you could play however you want, and you could subvert it, you could reconfigure it, you can combine these different types, and you can apply them also to smaller groups. I'm going off on a tangent a little bit here, but Laurel and Hardy was an Auguste and a hobo, I suppose, maybe. Martin and Lewis, or our own Silent J and Bob, were kind of a certain configuration of this hierarchy that plays around with it a little bit, but it's pretty straightforward anyways as a comedy team. I'm mentioning all of this to get back to the point, to say that I think we can read Joey, Snake, and Wheels as an expression of the clown hierarchy, both in terms of writing, but also more in terms of the realism that the show is portraying of these characters as a friend group. Joey as the leader, we would think of as the white clown. Snake, because of his personality, because he lacks confidence and it's easy to make him the butt of the joke, he's the Auguste. So Joey, again, he likes having a laugh at Snake's expense. We see this pretty often in the series. And Snake just inhabits a role and manifests himself in a way that makes it easy for Joey to do that. Wheels is either a hobo clown or a tramp clown, totally incidentally. Just for the sake of general interest, I want to read how the International Shrine Clown Association defines the tramp and the hobo. The tramp believes the world owes him a living, that his condition is caused by others. He wants and expects everybody to feel sorry for him. He does everything in his power to avoid work. This shaggy vagabond is the individual for whom nothing ever goes right. The hobo wants to be a hobo. He may be down, but he certainly is not out. He often appears to be happy. A hobo usually will not ask for a handout, preferring to work for it. He will take a job, but usually not for long because he wants to move along to someplace else. I guess you'll agree that either of those are pretty apt descriptions of Wheels at various moments throughout Degrassi. In any event, the clown hierarchy is a trope that comes out of performance, but don't life and art imitate one another? As much as Degrassi was a didactic, educational program, it was also entertainment. And the way the characters are written, they do in my opinion, often kind of update classic comic themes, particularly when we see characters cast into the kind of more comic subplot roles. It's just kind of a sensibility that I don't know if it was Kit Hood that was behind that, or Linda Schuyler, or Yan Moore. I always feel like it's probably more of a Kit Hood thing, but you know, I'm not that much of an expert on the dynamics between Kit and Linda. But in any event, you might think that the interjection of this kind of heavily coded comic relief stereotypes or tropes, roles, I guess, you might think that would inject a kind of artifice into Degrassi. But the thing is, we're in the age of mass media, of mass culture, and the tropes of entertainment just kind of become second nature, not only to us as viewers, but to us as individuals relating to one another. And Joey, Snake, and Wheels were also products of mass media and mass culture. So I feel like it's realistic to see friends coming to relate to each other in this way, and how they like joke around and regard one another. I see it as a way that these characters just relate. They learned to relate to one another. And it was so baked into their personalities and their expectations, and ultimately baked into their friendship, that it doesn't feel theatrical to see it. Even if its roots are in performance and theater, when we lay out what the clown hierarchy is, it's also just a kind of group dynamic that you see in the real world. And I would say, when you watch Schools Out, everything that happens between Joey, Snake, and Wheels can be understood as kind of a culmination of this dynamic. Specifically, we would understand it as ultimately a toxic dynamic, I think, when we analyze Schools Out. And it's also something that I think carried over to the next generation. In truth, we know that Joey has no real room to deride or ridicule Snake. And in truth, Snake and Wheels know this as well. In fact, we often do see them deriding Joey when he starts to brag and get a little too big for his britches. It's kind of one of the few things that Snake and Wheels can kind of bond over, actually. But Joey's vanity never comes out diminished, no matter how many times his kind of goofy schemes end up backfiring. Nor do we ever see Snake's insecurity abated. Nor does Wheels ever seem to cease feeling displaced. So when we put their personalities together, the dynamic that it yields, because they're kind of stuck in these patterns, and they have these views of themselves and these views of each other, the dynamic that it yields is this kind of hierarchy. And Joey, whether merely just joking around and good fun or not, I think he ends up reinforcing Snake's sense of inadequacy. To step back a little again and look at this stuff in the larger context of contemporary entertainment, in the post-Seinfeld comic landscape of the last 20 years, maybe we've learned to view this hierarchy as a toxic kind of thing. That was kind of the point of the Seinfeld series finale, I think. Just the idea that, yeah, these are terrible people. And it's something that they also played with in Seinfeld in the Bizarro Jerry episodes, where we saw an alternative version of the Seinfeld friend group, where what would we like if they were actually nice to each other? In sitcoms that followed Seinfeld, I'd say that we see the hierarchy often in a sort of abjected form. So It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia or Trailer Park Boys. Every character in those shows ends up being kind of hybrids of the types within the clown hierarchy. They're always kind of in a goose or a hobo trying to be a white clown, trying to get one over on everyone else, and no one ever really comes out on top in any way that isn't just very petty in those kind of post-Seinfeld shows. Again, art and life maybe reflect each other in the dystopian 21st century, where it's like, yeah, we're going to have a broken down version of the clown hierarchy because that probably reflects something about the larger culture that we're in. But for Degrassi, looking at Schools Out way back in 1992, I feel like they were already illustrating this point that this kind of dynamic can ultimately strain relationships to the point of like termination, let's say. And you know, I'm not saying that they were consciously setting out to deconstruct the clown hierarchy as a trope by any means. I mean, I don't think that was on their minds, but I do think that's one way to view Schools Out and understand why it is a very good movie and a very good culmination to Degrassi. It's a movie that I know a lot of fans have a problem with, and I mean, hopefully talking about it in this way maybe will help inspire people to take more enjoyment out of this movie. That is really honestly a bummer to see what happens in it, but I think it's a good kind of bummer in a lot of ways. The hierarchy of this friendship that I think is portrayed by the time you get to Schools Out, and of course you have a whole lost season. We don't see, there's a year between Degrassi High and Schools Out that just isn't there. But I feel like by the time we see these friends leaving high school in Schools Out, there's a sense that they're just in a rut as friends. And the film shows just Snake feeling like he has so much pressure on him and no real relief or release from it, largely owing, again, I think, to his own kind of insecurities and his own inabilities to make good on what he has to offer. And also much of it also admittedly coming from his friends in the way that they treat him and the way that they probably aren't very supportive or nurturing towards Snake as a sensitive guy. It reaches a boiling point. The friendship and the kind of hierarchy that they've gotten into in just the way they joke around with one another. So adding to the strength of it, I think it's just totally in continuity with everything we'd seen about these characters throughout the series. I mean, they built to get to Schools Out, and they've been pretty consistent about these characters and their relationships to one another in very subtle ways, I'd say. All of the dynamics and nuances of their relationship had been pretty well established over the 5 seasons of the original Degrassi, leading to, again, a very unpleasant payoff. I understand it's super unpleasant, but I just don't understand when fans talk about Schools Out as if it doesn't make perfect sense, because I think it does make perfect sense. In Schools Out, we see the flaws and failures of these characters finally straining their relationship to the point of dissolution. And then, to go even further, in the next generation, we see Snake's resentment of Wheels has continued and is as strong as it ever was. When I watch the next generation and think about the way Snake talks about Wheels, I feel like Snake had finally been given a reason to rationalize hating Wheels. The issue, it's not given a lot of dialogue, but it is striking, and I always feel like the other characters who are there when Snake is talking about how terrible Wheels is, they feel a little bit awkward, I want to say, about Snake's ongoing grudge towards Wheels. It's like they understand there's something else at stake for Snake in his hatred of Wheels, besides just the fact that Wheels drank and drove and had an accident that, you know, killed a child and crippled Lucy. There was something else at stake for Snake, I think. I don't know if I can say precisely what it was, but I hope that this video helps to at least outline the shape of Snake's resentments and what else was at stake in his psyche around his friendship with Joey and Wheels.